Chapter 1. The Tale of the Jibber Jabber Monster. A ragtag group of boys gathered beneath a tall tree at the far edge of the playground with their full attention fixed on Jimmy Jenkins. It was evident from his appearance that he was sharing something very important. Jimmy, a scrawny, brown-haired boy, wore an oversized t-shirt, making him appear much younger than his actual age of 9.5 years old. The Jibber Jabber Monster lives in a deep, dark forest, in a deep, dark cave. However, every summer it comes out in search of food, Jimmy began, his voice low. It eats until its belly is so big that it can't move an inch. Then it stores the rest away in its cave, where it stays for the long winter and comes out again in the spring. You'll know a Jibber Jabber monster if you hear one because of its strange speech. It's constantly blabbering, jibber jabber, jibber jabber, jibber jabber. You'll want to look at the Jibber Jabber Monster when you hear it, but don't do it. A small hand shot up, belonging to little Jacob Peach, the youngest and tiniest member of the group. He absent-mindedly rubbed his cheek, leaving behind a smudge of dirt. Wide-eyed and clutching his knees, he inquired, "Why shouldn't we look at it?" Jimmy Jenkins looked Jacob over intently, then swept his gaze across each boy. Lowering his voice, he whispered, "Because if you look at the Jibber Jabber Monster at the same time he is looking at you, you'll turn into a Jibber Jabber Monster yourself." Gasps filled the air as the younger boy collapsed to the ground. The older boys erupted into laughter. "Ha ha ha." Billy Rottenbottom sarcastically chuckled. He was the eldest of the group, at almost 11. Everyone knows there is no such thing as a Jibber Jabber Monster. The uproar of laughter echoed through the playground as scowling-faced Billy strolled over to the cluster of bikes and scooters and retrieved his own. One by one, the other boys followed suit, until only Jimmy's loyal companion, Carl Wingman, was left standing beside him. Little Jacob Peach, the last to retrieve his scooter, firmly planted his wheels on the ground. Looking up at Jimmy, he declared, "I believe you, Jimmy." A warm smile spread across Jimmy's face as he replied, "Thank you, Jacob." Carl placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Let's head home, Jimmy," he suggested. "It's getting late." They watched the rest of the group disperse before heading home themselves. Chapter 2. The Mysterious House of Mrs. Haggard. Jimmy and Carl trudged along the sidewalk of the sleepy little town of Willow Creek, their bikes in tow, and the sun fading below the horizon. The houses were neatly spaced, each one new and well-maintained. However, there was one house in the neighborhood that stood out like a sore thumb. The two boys stopped in front of it, beside a large bush, and peered through the rusty metal fence at the eerie old house. "This is old Mrs. Haggard's house," Carl whispered, afraid the lady might hear him even though she was nowhere in sight. "My brother says she's a witch." "This place sure is creepy," Jimmy said, halfway convinced Carl's brother was right. Carl nodded in agreement. "No doubt about it. Did you bring the book?" "Yeah," Jimmy said, reflecting on his conversation with Mr. Gates, the school librarian, the day before. He had been searching through the endless rows of books and finally exclaimed in desperation, "None of these will do. I need an exceptional book with adventure and danger around every corner, one that will transport me to a world filled with mystery, where no one has to do the dishes or take out the garbage." "I have just the book," Mr. Gates had said. Stepping behind the checkout desk and scanning his collection, his eyes finally came to rest on one of particular interest. He handed the book to Jimmy with a twinkle in his eye, knowing that this book would ignite the young boy's imagination. Jimmy excitedly scanned the cover, but then his furrowed brow revealed his doubt. "The story of the Jibber Jabber Monster," he asked. "Are you sure I'm going to like this?" "Trust me," he said. "You'll love it," he assured the young boy with a mischievous glint in his eyes. Jimmy gathered his thoughts back to the present moment. Propping his bike against the bush, he dropped his backpack to the ground and unzipped it. He retrieved the large, dusty book and flipped through the pages until he found a picture of a dimly lit old house that had an uncanny resemblance to old Mrs. Haggard's house. Once he saw it, he handed the book to Carl for him to inspect. Carl curled over the pages and studied the picture. "What do you think?" he asked Jimmy. "Do you think it's the same house?" "It sure looks like the same one," Jimmy said as Carl returned the book to him. He lowered his voice to a whisper as a chill pricked at the back of his neck. "If we're right, that means old Mrs. Haggard is a—" His voice trailed off. A deep voice from behind them finished his sentence. "A witch?" Startled, the boys spun around to find Mr. Gates standing behind them. "Mr. Gates," the boys exclaimed in unison. "Hello, boys. Is that the book you checked out yesterday?" Mr. Gates inquired, seeming very pleased with himself for the recommendation. "Yes," Jimmy replied, hesitating for a moment. "And don't worry. I'll return it." Mr. Gates raised an eyebrow, gazing steadily at Jimmy. "But not yet," Jimmy continued. "I still need it." Before they could say another word, the door of the old house creaked open. A black cat darted out, disappearing behind the house into the fading light. In its wake emerged a deathly figure of an old haggard woman, exuding evil from every pore. She turned to stare at them. Her hollow eyes looked straight through them. It was like a searing hot poker burning into their soul. The boys stood paralyzed as they met the gaze of the dark, eerie woman. Jimmy's grip tightened on the book in his hands as his mind raced. Could this book have the answers he needed to uncover the mystery surrounding this house? He glanced at Mr. Gates, who nodded subtly as if he knew his thoughts and was encouraging him to trust his instincts. The witch turned and struggled with something or someone inside the door. The tension was almost more than Jimmy could bear. After what seemed like an eternity, she pulled an old knotted broomstick from the dark interior. It sent a shiver down Jimmy's spine, as if an invisible hand had traced icy fingers along his back. "I have a bad feeling about this," Jimmy said. Mr. Gates, ever the voice of reason, even seemed rattled. Prying the book from Jimmy's hands and stuffing it into his backpack, he said, "I think it's time for us to go, boys." Jimmy hoisted his pack onto his back, thanking Mr. Gates, who turned and quickly strode toward home. Without hesitation, the two boys mounted their bikes and sped away. Chapter 3. The Secrets in the Pages. The next day after school, Jimmy and Carl met at the playground to discuss their action plan. The playground was deserted, except for little Jacob Peach, playing ball with his two older sisters. As soon as he spotted Jimmy, he abandoned his sisters and hurried over. "Do you want to play?" he asked eagerly. "Not right now, Jacob." "We have some important business to attend to," Jimmy replied, as he pulled out the book and took a seat on the bench. "Is that the book Mr. Gates gave you? The one about the Jibber Jabber Monster?" Jacob inquired. "Yes, it is," Jimmy confirmed, thumbing through to his sought-after page. "Can I see it?" Jacob persisted. Jimmy hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should let Jacob see the book. After all, if it contained the powerful spells and dangerous secrets he believed it did, it needed to be protected at all cost. But seeing the eagerness in Jacob's eyes, he decided to trust him. "All right, but promise me you won't tell anyone. You saw what happened yesterday when I tried to warn everyone," Jimmy said, positioning the book for both boys to see. Peering at the pages, Carl asked, "Have you found anything useful?" "Not yet," Jimmy admitted. "Let's continue reading." He began under the picture of a young man in battle with an evil witch, wearing a black hooded cloak. After finding the spot where he had left off, he continued reading. Jerry Putnam encountered the witch in the town square. He accused her of using her magic to make trouble. Enraged, the witch cried out in fiery fury, gibberish, and cast a spell. Her dark incantation formed a dark cloud so thick that it filled the sky like a plume of volcanic ash. That night, Jerry Putnam vanished without a trace. From that day forward, Jerry's sudden disappearance became a mystery that haunted the town. However, it was rumored that the witch possessed a map within her house, pinpointing Jerry Putnam's whereabouts. To this day, the map remains hidden from all but true believers. Carl's expression turned fearful. Whoa! The witch has the map. You know what that means. Jimmy nodded. We have to search the house, he said, pushing back a lump in his throat. Jacob protested. But she's a witch. What if she turns us into toads? Carl added. I bet the whole place is covered in cobwebs. Jacob's face went pale, and maybe there is a gigantic spider waiting to eat us. Perhaps she will even eat us, Carl added, his voice filled with fear. Jacob began nervously biting along his nails. Listening to the boy's concerns, Jimmy pondered for a moment before speaking. There's only one thing we can do. We'll keep a watchful eye on the house and determine when she goes out. We'll go in when she's not there. Chapter 4. The Stakeout. For the next week, the boys diligently observed old Mrs. Haggard's house. Jacob took the morning shift, scooting past her house on his way to school. He noticed that she left the house every morning at 8 o'clock. Carl took the afternoon shift. Leaning out his bedroom window with binoculars pressed against his face, he witnessed her return home promptly at 4 o'clock every day. Jimmy, being the closest neighbor, took the evening shift. After dinner, once he helped his older twin brothers and little sister tidy up the kitchen, he stood in his front yard, pretending to polish his bike. He discovered that old Mrs. Haggard would leave the house every Wednesday evening between 5 and 7 o'clock. Every day at school, the boys obtained a hall pass from their teacher and convened in the library. They meticulously recorded their observations, gradually discerning a pattern. Finally, they knew precisely when they needed to make their move. On Wednesday evening, as the boys waited for old Mrs. Haggard to leave, Carl and Jacob stood in Jimmy's driveway. Carl sat on his bike, while Jacob popped ollies on his skateboard. Jimmy had his bike turned upside down, pretending to polish it. Jacob panted between jumps. It's been like 30 minutes. What's taking her so long? Jimmy glanced at the dark house. Just a few more minutes. She's got to come out soon, he assured his friend as he tried to find a spot that had not been polished in the last week. She finally emerged from the house, stared disgustedly in their direction, and walked south toward town, as usual. As soon as she was out of sight, they dashed to the hedges at the edge of Jimmy's yard and looked to see if she was truly gone. After pushing through the bush and looking toward town, Carl said, I don't see her anymore. Breathing a sigh of relief, the trio confirmed that the coast was clear. They had been waiting for this moment all week, meticulously planning their every move to ensure they wouldn't be caught by the cunning witch. With their hearts pounding in their chest, Jimmy, Carl, and Jacob cautiously tiptoed toward old Mrs. Haggard's house. The evening sky, painted hues of orange and pink, cast an eerie glow over the neighborhood. The wind whispered through the trees, adding an extra layer of suspense to their mission. As they approached the witch's house, they noticed the eerie silence that enveloped the area. The usual sounds of chirping birds and distant laughter vanished, replaced by an unsettling stillness. It was as if the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. Jimmy took the lead. He motioned for the others to follow him as he stealthily crept toward the open window at the side of the house. The boys couldn't help but shudder at the thought of what secrets lay hidden within. When we get inside, we have to be quick, Jimmy cautioned, as he sized up the distance between them and the window. The boys nodded in agreement. Jacob, you're the only one small enough to make it through the window, Jimmy said. We'll have to hoist you up. Do you think you can do it? Jacob boldly stepped forward. I can do it, he declared, squaring his shoulders like a resolute soldier. Carl helped Jacob climb onto Jimmy's shoulders. They lifted him until his head touched the window. "What do you see?" Carl asked after a minute of unsuccessfully stretching to see inside for himself. "It's the kitchen," Jacob reported. "Can you make it in?" Jimmy asked. Jacob replied, "Just a little higher." The boys lifted him higher, and Jacob grabbed a hold of the window frame, pulled himself up, and disappeared inside. Jimmy and Carl listened closely, but there was only silence. Seconds passed. Jimmy called out, "Jacob, are you okay?" Chapter 5. The Witch's Lair. The two boys stood quietly, feeling the tension in the air thicken with each passing second. The silence around them seemed to stretch on endlessly. They exchanged nervous glances. Then, from the corner of their eyes, they noticed a flicker of movement behind the house. The boys stiffened. Suddenly, a figure leaped out from the shadows, causing them to gasp and stumble back. "Come on, it's open!" Jacob shouted, a triumphant grin spreading across his face. Relieved, the three boys entered through the back door, which led into a kitchen lined with pots of herbs and what most certainly looked like potions in Jimmy's opinion. "Let's keep going," he said with a shiver. They continued exploring the house, passing a large library covered in cobwebs. "Cobwebs!" Carl exclaimed. "I was right." Half expecting to see a giant spider appear at any moment, Jacob asked, "What else were you right about?" Suddenly, a loud, raspy caw rang out as a black crow emerged from a spooky cuckoo clock. The boys froze, looking for the source of the sound. "It's just a clock," Jimmy reassured them. "Let's hope we find this map quickly." The raven's eyes glowed an eerie red as it perched on top of the clock, its gaze fixed on the boys. It called again, its voice echoing through the silent house. "Do you think that's the witch's familiar?" Carl whispered, his eyes wide with fear. "What's a familiar?" Jacob asked, trying as best he could to ignore the raven's piercing gaze. But no matter where he moved, the raven's eyes seemed to follow. "My brother told me all about them. He said they are the witch's spies. It can be any animal, like a snake, an owl, or even a cat. It can talk to her, understand her every command. It can sneak into places no one else can and bring back secrets. And sometimes it can cast spells, small ones, but powerful enough to cause trouble." Carl replied, leaning in closer. Jacob's eyes were now as wide as saucers. "What kind of trouble?" he whispered. Carl's voice remained low and serious. "Oh, things like making you trip over nothing, or making you feel like someone's watching you when you're all alone. So if you ever hear an owl hooting in the dead of night, or see a black cat with glowing eyes, it might just be a witch's familiar keeping an eye on you." Jimmy rolled his eyes. "Don't scare him, Carl," he admonished. But as he moved deeper into the house, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. After searching the antique-filled dusty parlor, Jimmy said, "I don't see anything here." Chapter 6. Race against the witch. Hesitating momentarily, the three boys contemplated their next move before ascending the creaky staircase. At the top, they found themselves in a haunting corridor. The peeling wallpaper revealed layers underneath. The air smelled dusty and old, like a forgotten attic or an ancient book. It was as if the space had stories to tell, whispers of the past lingering in the air. As the young detectives tiptoed along, a row of doors stretched out before them. Jimmy and the boys cautiously opened the first door and were greeted by a room that seemed frozen in time. The air was still, the furniture covered in sheets. Undeterred, they began their search, lifting the sheets and opening drawers, hoping to stumble upon a hidden clue. But alas, the room held no secrets or treasures, leaving Jimmy even more determined to uncover the truth elsewhere. The boys walked into the next room and saw that it was very different from what they expected. It was dark, with only a few candles flickering, making spooky shadows on the old wooden floor. Jacob pointed to the wall covered in peculiar paintings of people. "Wow, look at them. They look like they are watching us." Jimmy's eyes trailed along the wall before falling on a big, fancy desk in the middle of the room. Leading the way, he said, "Guys, let's check out this desk over here." As they approached it, Carl immediately picked up a magnifying glass, laying atop some faded papers, and exclaimed, "Wow, look at all this stuff. Weird writings and astrological charts." He looked through the magnifying glass at the faded paper. "This looks like a bunch of strange ingredients for a very weird recipe," Jimmy cautioned. "Let's take a closer look. But remember, we must handle everything carefully. We don't want to leave a trace that anyone was here." Jacob, rummaging around in the desk drawer, exclaimed, "Hey, look what I found." In the top drawer was an old compass, an hourglass, and a peculiar-looking key. "They seem important, don't they?" Jimmy nodded. "Absolutely. These must be part of the mystery. We should take these with us." Carl, looking around at the creepy pictures, uttered, "Guys, look at the paintings. Is it me, or do those people look angry?" Jimmy and Jacob stopped to observe. Finally, Jimmy said, "I don't know, but I think we've got what we need here. Let's move on." They continued opening doors and searching rooms until they reached the last door. "Do you hear that?" Jacob whispered. The three boys tiptoed toward the sound. As they grew closer, they heard scratching. It grew louder with each step. "What could it be?" Carl whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know, but we have to find out," Jimmy said, with a determined look in his eyes. Jimmy turned the knob and pushed the door open. A black ball of fur screeched as it whizzed past them. Jacob plastered himself to the wall, wild with fear, making plenty of room for the ferocious feline to escape. Once safely out of harm's way, he breathed, "I really don't like cats." Once the commotion was over, Jimmy took note of the room. Like the others, this one was also dark. Only a few beams of light shone around the corners of the dark tapestries. As their eyes adjusted, they saw a large, four-poster bed, a wardrobe, and a vanity table. "This must be the witch's bedroom," Jimmy exclaimed, as Carl and Jacob gasped in awe and fear. They entered the room, hearts pounding in their chests. This was their last chance to find the map. "It smells like mothballs in here," Carl said, wrinkling his nose. Jacob ran his fingers over a claw-footed candle holder, while Carl stared at a black clock on the far wall. The design made it look as if pieces had broken off and had begun transforming into bats as they flew away. "What is it with these creepy clocks?" Carl wondered aloud. On top of a large dresser, a small jewelry box of curious workmanship caught Jimmy's attention. It had carefully crafted carvings and delicate details that showcased the skill of its creator. However, something was unsettling about it. The jewelry box had a twisted, sinister design, a combination of sharp edges, dark gemstones, and strange symbols. It exuded an air of malevolence, as if it held a dark secret within. Jimmy lifted the lid, and in the center, among various pieces of jewelry, was a golden locket. It seemed to call out to him. Picking it up, he tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Turning over the locket, he discovered a small keyhole. With sudden realization, he called out, "Jacob, the key." Jacob hurried over, handing over the key. Inside was a single folded piece of paper. At first glance, it seemed tiny, but when he unfolded it, he saw it was the map he was searching for. The mountains, rivers, and forests were intricately drawn out. There was even an X marking the spot. Jimmy exclaimed, finally, his excitement bubbling over. Carl turned his attention from the strange clock to Jimmy. "What is it?" he asked curiously. Jimmy held up the map triumphantly. "The map. We've finally found it." Carl's eyes widened, his mind quickly forgetting the eerie clock. He rushed over to Jimmy and stared at the map, scanning the markings. "So, where do we go?" he questioned. Jacob pushed between them and exclaimed, "Look, it has an X over Havenwood Forest." Carl's face paled. "That place is haunted." Jimmy shrugged. "That's just what everybody says." "It's not really haunted." Suddenly, a door slammed downstairs, causing the boys to jump. Jimmy cried in terror, "Old Mrs. Haggard is home." She grumbled as she searched the house. Angrily, she muttered, "I smell stinky children," as she stomped up the stairs. In a panic, the boys looked around the room, searching for an escape route. Their hearts raced as they realized they were trapped, with the witch closing in on them. They knew they had to think quickly and find a way to evade her. Jimmy's eyes darted around the room, desperately seeking a solution. Then, his gaze landed on the dark tapestries. "Come on," he said, motioning for the boys to follow him. In a flash, Mrs. Haggard was in the room, sniffing the air as she made her way to the open window. She scanned the yard, growling as she forcefully closed the window and retreated back into the house. Jimmy sighed in relief after the old witch was out of sight. That was close. The three boys had jumped from the window and quickly shimmied down the railing and rolled out of sight, narrowly escaping Mrs. Haggard's attention. Carl exclaimed, "We were almost witch meat." Jacob muttered, "We still could be." "Let's get out of here." And the boys hurriedly made their way home. Chapter 7. The Quest for Jerry Putnam. Bright and early the next morning, the three boys met at the playground at their usual spot at the picnic table. The boys crouched around the table as Jimmy unfolded the map. Their eyes scanned the cryptic symbols, hoping to decipher its secrets. Knowing that any successful mission required a strategy and gathering as much information as possible, Jimmy said, "We need to compile a list of everything we know." "You're right, Jimmy," Carl chimed in. "Before we set out to find Jerry Putnam, we need to brainstorm and connect the dots." Jimmy put his thinking cap on. 1. Jerry Putnam is mentioned in the book. There must be a reason for that. 2. The title of the book is The Jibber Jabber Monster. Little Jacob scratched his head, trying to make it all make sense. "So, Jerry Putnam is connected to the Jibber Jabber Monster?" "That's right. And get this, guys," Jimmy said, leaning closer. "I talked to Mr. Gates yesterday, and he told me that not only does Jerry Putnam have a deep connection with this town, but Jerry is also his nephew, and he was an explorer who dedicated his life to studying mythical creatures." "Maybe Jerry knew about the Jibber Jabber Monster," suggested Carl. "If we find him, we can find out what he knows." "But what does old Mrs. Haggard have to do with all this?" Jacob asked. "I don't know yet," Jimmy said as he tucked the map safely away. "Let's move on to the next order of business." "Did everyone bring supplies?" The boys checked their backpacks one last time. Jimmy had a small notepad to jot down any important findings and other necessary items. Carl carried a flashlight and a pocket knife, while Jacob had a first aid kit and walkie-talkies for communication. They were well equipped, ready to face the challenges that lay ahead. With a nod of assurance, Jimmy looked at his friends. "All right, guys, we've brainstormed, we've prepared, and now it's time to put our plan into action. Remember, finding Jerry Putnam and understanding his connection to the Jibber Jabber Monster is our top priority. Let's stay focused and be prepared for anything." Chapter 8. Havenwood Forest. As they stepped out of the safety of their meeting spot and climbed onto their bikes, the boys felt a surge of adrenaline. Their destination, Havenwood Forest, located on the edge of Lake Michigan, where X marked the spot. The coolness of the morning burned away as the sun climbed higher. By that time, Havenwood Forest had come into view. They dismounted their bikes and looked with uncertainty at the thick woods that loomed before them, the dense trees whispering and hiding mysteries yet to be unraveled. The trio walked in silence, their senses heightened as they kept an eye out for any signs that could lead them to Jerry Putnam. They scanned the surroundings, taking note of peculiar sounds and unusual markings along the way. Jimmy stopped to dig the map from his pocket, and with map in hand, the boys followed the path they thought would lead them to Jerry Putnam. Carl couldn't help but wonder aloud about the Jibber Jabber Monster as they trekked through the forest. What do you think the Jibber Jabber Monster eats? Good question, Carl, Jimmy said. I guess we'll find out once we catch it. Jacob contemplated the monster's diet as he looked around the forest, his imagination magnifying his growing hunger. Maybe it eats honeycomb cereal, or mushroom sandwiches, or tree bark pizza, he mused. The boys laughed, momentarily forgetting the seriousness of their quest. Imagining the Jibber Jabber Monster munching on absurd delicacies brought a sense of lightheartedness to their minds. But seriously, Jimmy said, let's stay focused on finding Jerry Putnam. We can theorize about the Jibber Jabber Monster's diet later. Carl and Jacob nodded, the laughter subsiding as they refocused their attention on the task at hand. The mystery of the Jibber Jabber Monster would have to wait as they pursued their primary objective. Chapter 9. Feast Beside the Lake. The boys soon came to a fork in the road. It branched off into a pebbled path one way and a grassy path the other. Jimmy contemplated which way to go. Then he had an idea. Jacob, do you still have the compass? Jacob nodded and quickly held out the compass. It pointed squarely at the grassy path, and without hesitation, they proceeded on their way. The forest thinned out near the lakeside, and they soon found their feet crunching over the sandy beach of Lake Michigan. Looking around, Jimmy said, I don't see anyone for miles. He observed 3 foldable camping chairs and 3 fishing poles next to a ready-to-make campfire. He examined the fishing poles and camp chairs. Someone was here recently, he noted. Do you think it was Jerry Putnam? Carl asked. Jimmy shook his head, scanning the area for any other signs of recent activity. I don't know. It's possible. Let's take a closer look and see if we can find any clues. They approached the campfire cautiously, careful not to disturb any potential evidence. Jacob pointed to a half-eaten fire-roasted salmon and noticed smoke rising from the hot coals. Looks like someone was having a cookout. They sure left in a hurry. Carl observed the surrounding area, noticing a small trail leading into the woods. Hey guys, look over there. There's a path leading deeper into the forest. Do you want to follow it? Just at that moment, Jacob's stomach growled like a ferocious beast awakening from a deep slumber. Looking back at the fishing poles, then exchanging glances with his friends, Jimmy asked, Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Jacob's eyes widened with excitement, understanding Jimmy's implication. You mean, we catch fish and cook them here? Absolutely. Carl grinned, the idea resonating with him as well. Yeah, I'm starving. Plus, it'll give us a chance to rest and recharge before we continue our search for Jerry. The boys quickly grabbed the fishing poles and set up near the edge of the lake. With a bit of patience and skillful casting, they caught a good number of decent-sized fish within a short amount of time. Excitement filled the air as they gathered around the campfire, preparing the fish for cooking. They cleaned and seasoned the fish with salt, pepper, and a few herbs they found lying around the campsite. The aroma of the sizzling fish filled the air, making their mouths water with anticipation. As the fish cooked over the open flames, the boys sat on the camping chairs, allowing themselves a moment of relaxation. The crackling of the fire and the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore created a soothing atmosphere. Once the fish were cooked to perfection, they eagerly dug into their impromptu meal. The tender and flaky fish melted in their mouths, satisfying their hunger and re-energizing their spirits. They laughed and shared stories, grateful for the unexpected break in their adventure. The sun began its descent, casting a warm golden glow across the sky, and the boys sat captivated by its beauty. Finally, Jimmy said, "I ate way too much," as he rubbed his stomach with a satisfied grin. "But it was totally worth it. That was some delicious fish." "I don't think I can move an inch," Carl groaned, leaning back into his comfortable chair. "I'm just going to rest here until this food coma wears off. Can't exactly solve a mystery if we can't move, right?" "You're right," Jacob moaned. "I underestimated the power of a full stomach." Jimmy rubbed his belly. "I guess we really did overdo it. Good thing we got permission to camp out tonight." "I don't think we could make it back home in our condition," Jimmy said, then wondered aloud. "I wonder where all this stuff came from." All of a sudden, they heard low murmurings coming from the forest. The footsteps grew louder, and they could make out the sound of twigs snapping. Chapter 10. Meeting the Jibber Jabber Monster. "Quiet," Jimmy whispered. "Did you hear that?" "Yes. What is it?" Jacob whispered, his voice trembling. "I have no idea," Jimmy replied. His eyes darted nervously around the forest. "But we need to stay quiet and hidden." The boys slunk down into their chairs and hid. They tried to make sense of the low grumblings. The sound came from all directions, as if from the trees themselves. The boys shushed each other and strained to hear. As they quieted down, the words gradually became clear. It was audible and unmistakable. "Jibber jabber, jibber jabber, jibber jabber," the sound repeated. "It's the Jibber Jabber Monster," Jacob squeaked. Carl panicked. "We'll all become Jibber Jabber Monsters." Jimmy reassured them. "Remember, we prepared for this. We'll be all right. Just remember what we talked about." Jimmy fumbled through his backpack, his hands trembling as he picked through the contents. He finally found what he was looking for, a mirror. It was his secret weapon. According to the book, one could not look upon the Jibber Jabber Monster without becoming one. But through countless hours of research, Jimmy had theorized that the dark magic would not be able to pass through the mirror's reflection, making it safe for him and his friends to look upon the monster through the reflection of the mirror if they encountered it. "Let's hope this works," Jimmy said. "On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Jimmy held up his mirror and hoped his research had paid off. The boys gathered at Jimmy's side and gazed through the reflection. They were staring straight into the eyes of the Jibber Jabber Monster. "It's working," Jacob exclaimed, patting his face in disbelief. "I'm still me." A wave of relief washed over them. The dark magic emanating from the Jibber Jabber Monster was repelled by the reflective surface of the mirror, just as Jimmy had theorized. It was unable to penetrate through it and harm them. They realized that they could now observe the creature without the risk of falling under its spell. With newfound confidence and the mirror, the boys stared directly into the monster's eyes, unafraid of its hypnotic gaze. Jimmy studied the Jibber Jabber Monster. It was the color of pine needles and had thick, tangled fur covering its entire body. Only its mesmerizing eyes, glowing with hypnotic intensity, were visible through the hairy mass. The Jibber Jabber Monster seemed confused, and once he spotted them, he attempted to flee, but Jimmy said, "Wait. Don't go." Surprised by Jimmy's plea, the Jibber Jabber Monster hesitated in its attempt to escape. Its hypnotic eyes curiously locked onto Jimmy's, fear evident in its gaze. The boys could sense a flicker of something almost human in the creature's expression. "Guys," Jimmy whispered, "I think it's afraid of us." Taking a step forward, Jimmy pleaded, "Please don't run away. We mean you no harm. We just want to understand you." "You can look at us through the mirrors," Carl explained. The Jibber Jabber Monster cautiously approached them and ran his hand along the mirror. Jimmy extended his hand, offering a gesture of trust. "My name is Jimmy," he said softly. "What's your name?" The creature hesitated, seeming to struggle with its own identity. Then, in a voice somewhere between a growl and a whisper, it uttered, "Jibber Jabber, Jibber Jabber, Jibber Jabber." Jimmy continued, "We're looking for Jerry Putnam. We think he might be able to help us understand what is going on." As the Jibber Jabber Monster responded with a repetitive cant of its own name, Jimmy and his friends exchanged puzzled glances. They realized that communication with the creature would require a different approach. Jimmy brought the book before the Jibber Jabber Monster and turned to the page showing Jerry Putnam engaged in battle with the evil witch. The trio stood in stunned silence as the monster's excited jabbering morphed into coherent English. You're looking for me?" The monster's voice was rough, like gravel being ground together, but human. It was a moment of utter surprise. You're Jerry Putnam?" Carl stuttered. "Jerry Putnam," the monster said again, as if tasting the name, its own name. Then, with an eerie quietness, it continued, "I am Jerry Putnam." Jacob, skeptical of the monster, scoffed. "Prove it." The monster didn't seem offended. Instead, he reached out a large, gnarled hand and pointed at a passage in the book. "Read this," he said. Jimmy complied, his voice shaking slightly as he read aloud a passage describing Jerry's signature move in battle. A complex series of feints and strikes that left his enemies dazed and confused. Then, right there in the clearing, the monster repeated the move. It was a strange sight, a creature of such size and ferocity, moving with such grace and precision. But it was undeniably the same move, performed with the same skill and flair. Jerry Putnam recounted confronting a witch, and how she placed a nasty spell on him. "Not surprised," Jacob exclaimed. "It was old Mrs. Haggard. We knew she was a witch." The boys were speechless. Finally, Jimmy broke the silence. "Jerry, Mr. Putnam, we need your help. We need to talk to you, to understand you, so we can break the curse and get you out of this forest." Jerry nodded, a somber expression on his monstrous face. "I've been hoping for this day," he said. "Let's get started. But there is something you need to know," the creature expressed. "I'm not the only one of my kind." The Jibber Jabber Monster waved its furry arm towards the forest. Jimmy, Carl, and Jacob sat upright, their gazes locked onto the forest, where glowing eyes emerged from behind every tree trunk. "You can reveal yourselves, everyone," Jerry called. "We're safe. These boys are our friends." Jacob gasped in disbelief. There must be 100 of them. After the monsters had gathered around and got settled, Jimmy read the pages of the text aloud. To undo the spell, one must return to the place it was cast at the exact moment the witch uttered it. "That will be next Friday," Jerry said, "exactly 1 week before All Hallows Eve, the day it all started. It's also the night of the town costume contest. It will be the perfect cover for us," he said excitedly. Jimmy, Carl, Jacob, and the Jibber Jabber Monsters quickly hatched a plan to revisit the town at that precise time. Their hearts were light with relief that they might finally break free from their monstrous forms and reunite with their loved ones. The rest of the night was a merry blur of shared laughter and dancing beneath the twinkling canopy of the sky until fatigue claimed them, and they laid down to a peaceful slumber. Chapter 11. A Tasty Trap. When morning arrived, the boys bid farewell to the Jibber Jabber Monsters, their hearts filled with a renewed sense of hope. They embarked on their journey homeward, their steps light and buoyant, as if the weight of their burden had been lifted. The monsters, now tamed and docile, watched them with curious eyes, their mischievous nature subdued by the boys' bravery and determination. The day their plan was to be put into action, the boys awoke with the first rays of dawn, their hearts pounding with excitement. They gathered outside old Mrs. Haggard's house, their eyes fixed on the door, waiting for her to release her feline companion as she did every morning. Jimmy initiated an inventory check, his voice resolute and filled with purpose, like a boy on a mission. "Cage?" "Check," Carl responded, his voice steady. "String?" "Check," Carl confirmed again. "Baloney?" A moment of silence hung in the air, as the realization dawned upon them that the baloney was missing. All eyes turned to Jacob, who patted his pockets with a look of panic. Finally, with a large grin, he produced the missing baloney. "Check," he declared, relief washing over the group. With their supplies in order, they set their trap with meticulous precision, their hands moving with practiced ease. They positioned themselves nearby, hidden from view, and held their breath in anticipation. Each passing second felt like an eternity as they waited for their plan to unfold. And then, as if guided by fate, the cat sauntered by, captivated by the scent of baloney. It darted straight into the trap, its fate sealed by the boys' ingenuity. A collective sigh of relief escaped their lips, mingling with jubilant cries of victory. "Baloney." "It works every time," Carl remarked, with a look of satisfaction crossing his face. Later that day, Mrs. Haggard discovered the note affixed to her door. The note said, "Your cat is in our custody. If you wish to see it again, meet us at the town square tonight at 7 o'clock sharp. Jimmy Jenkins." After reading the note, a storm of anger and frustration brewed within her. She crumpled the note in her hand, her eyes burning with a fiery determination. "Those meddling kids," she muttered, her voice laced with malevolent intent. "They'll get what's coming to them. I'll make sure of that." Chapter 12. A spellbinding showdown. Jimmy and Carl stood in the heart of the town square, the rhythmic gurgling of the nearby fountain providing a soothing backdrop to their mounting tension. Their eyes were met with a kaleidoscope of Halloween costumes, each more imaginative than the last. Ghosts, goblins, witches, and werewolves mingled with princesses, superheroes, and mythical creatures created a fantastical spectacle. Their own costume of the Three Musketeers paled in comparison, but it helped them blend in nonetheless. The air was filled with the eerie strains of Halloween music, the haunting melodies and spine-chilling harmonies, slicing through the festive chatter. The scent of candy corn and caramel apples blew through the air with a crisp, chill breeze. Unexpectedly, Mr. Gates appeared at Jimmy and Carl's side. "Good evening, boys," he said. His eyes twinkled with a mischievous glimmer. Before they could fully comprehend his arrival, Jacob came sprinting towards them. His breathless voice carried a sense of urgency. "She's coming!" he exclaimed. His words hung in the air like a foreboding omen. In that split second, Jimmy forgot about the presence of Mr. Gates. He sounded a sharp whistle. It pierced the air and prompted the Jibber Jabber Monster to get into position. Carl's fists clenched tightly, and his knuckles turned white, a telltale sign of his anxiety. "If we botch this, we'll be nothing more than amphibious creatures. Better for nothing more than to be used in one of her horrid brews," he muttered. The ground seemed to tremble as old Mrs. Haggard approached. Her heavy footsteps echoed ominously through the square. "She sure looks mad," Carl said. "We could still make a run for it," he suggested, his voice barely audible. "We can handle this," Jimmy reassured him, his voice steady despite the dangerous situation. He removed the hourglass he had taken from the witch's house, from underneath his coat, and set it down on the edge of the fountain. We have to do this by the time the last grain of sand falls, or Jerry and the others will remain Jibber Jabber monsters forever." Old Mrs. Haggard advanced, her voice a chilling rasp as she demanded, "The cat? Where is it, boy?" "Here goes nothing," Jimmy muttered. Jimmy and Carl stepped aside, revealing the Jibber Jabber monster cradling the cat. The monster locked eyes with the witch as he handed the cat over, and in a blinding flash, she transformed into a Jibber Jabber monster. She recoiled in surprise, dropping the cat, which quickly scampered away. Flailing around, the witch chanted, "Jibber Jabber, Jibber Jabber, Jibber Jabber." Her wild movements caused the townspeople to stop what they were doing and gasp with surprise. They decided it must be part of the show. As she flailed about, uttering nonsensical phrases, the townsfolk erupted into laughter. Enraged, old Mrs. Haggard withdrew her magic wand, her voice a venomous hiss as she cast a spell that would reveal her true horrible form. A cloud of smoke enveloped her, and when it cleared, she stood there with a pointed hat, eyes flowing with fierce light, and wiry gray hair cascading down to her knees. She glared at Jimmy, her voice a threatening growl. "You'll pay for this, my dear," she said, as she began to mutter a spell. The atmosphere crackled with an electric charge, and dark clouds brewed above like a giant witch's cauldron. The townspeople scattered like autumn leaves caught in a gust of wind, seeking shelter from the impending doom. "Something's happening." Jimmy's voice pierced through the howling wind, carrying a sense of urgency and fear. As the witch prepared to unleash her final incantation, the air grew heavy. But the power of it seemed to escape her, and even she, with all her wickedness, fell silent and stopped and stared at the sky in great fear. Thunder clapped, and in a dazzling display of nature's fury, a sharp bolt of lightning sliced through the darkened sky. It descended with the speed of a shooting star, guided by an unseen hand, and struck the witch with unerring precision. There was a blinding flash of light, followed by a blood-curdling scream. The sound echoed through the square. A portal crackled with energy, and 3 witches emerged, their forms shimmering and radiant. The first one was adorned with vibrant blue from head to toe. Her garments flowed like waves and cast a glittering glow. Her hair flowed in brilliant strands of sapphire, shimmering with a luster that mirrored the depths of the oceans. Her blue eyes sparkled with inner magic, reflecting the mysteries of the vast sky above, and carried in them tranquility and wisdom. The other 2 were just as enchanting, with one in red and another in yellow. Their presence commanded attention, their very essence exuding power and wisdom. The Blue Witch spoke, her voice resonating with the authority of 3 voices combined. "Hagatha," the Blue Witch said, speaking to old Mrs. Haggard.
"You have once again abused your magic,"
she scolded, her words laced with disappointment. She paused as she inhaled deeply.
"I smell a spell. We warned you long ago of the consequences that would befall you if you continued to use your magic for mischief. Reverse your actions now, or face dire consequences."
Jimmy looked at the hourglass. The last grain of sand fell. The witch wailed in frustration. Her fists pounded the air in a futile attempt to defy her fate. She let out a scream of anger before begrudgingly sweeping her magic-infused hands over the crowd. The Jibber Jabber monsters waited expectantly, but nothing happened. Jimmy and the Jibber Jabber monsters shared a look of sadness. It seemed their fate was sealed, doomed to be Jibber Jabber monsters forever. But suddenly, the Jibber Jabber monsters, scattered among the townspeople, began to transform back into their original human forms. The portal shimmered once more, beckoning the witches to return to their realm. With a final glance at Mrs. Haggard, the Blue Witch declared,
"Now come, Hagatha. It is time for you to face the consequences of your actions."
And with that, the 3 witches stepped back through the portal, disappearing from sight. Compelled to comply or face certain doom, she cast one final angry glance at Jimmy and his friends before stepping into the portal, leaving no trace of her presence behind. The townsfolk looked around, their eyes wide with recognition and disbelief. The people who had once been Jibber Jabber monsters were now standing before them as people, their faces etched with relief. They were individuals who had vanished mysteriously, leaving their loved ones in a state of perpetual worry and longing. Mr. Gates recognized his nephew at once. "Jerry, my boy, I can't believe it," he exclaimed as he came close to hug the boy. "Your mother is going to be so happy to see you." Tears of joy streamed down the faces of the reunited families. As they embraced, their hearts overflowed with gratitude and happiness. The town erupted into a chorus of celebration, filling the air with laughter and the sound of heartfelt reunions. Amidst the jubilant atmosphere, Jimmy, Carl, and Jacob were hailed as heroes. The townspeople gathered around them, thanking them for their bravery. That night, Jimmy bid his family goodnight and headed off to bed. As he placed the book of the Jibber Jabber Monster gently on his bedside table, a hushed stillness fell over the room. He was exhausted from the day's excitement and quickly drifted into a deep slumber. Undetected by the sleeping boy, a curious wind rustled through the room, as if it held the secrets of 1,000 tales waiting to be told. It gracefully danced across the pages of the book, stirring up the words into a wisp of smoke. The words rose up like condensation. They hung in the air in a moment of suspended animation, as if time itself had paused to witness the amazing sight. With a graceful twirl, the words of the previous story faded away. In their place, a new story appeared.